Hello and good morning, kind friends and companions. I'm Morgan Donner, and I decided that I am in the mood to make a shirt. I did my usual thing. I went online to look for inspiration, see if there's any cool features that I want to make sure to include. And while searching, I found my own website from 10 years ago. One of my very first dress diary blog type things was how to make an Elizabethan shift. This specific shift, in fact. I am very curious to see how well or poorly it is aged. So I figured, you know what? Let me grab my fabric and the blog post and let's go on this adventure together. All right, let's see what we've got. So we start right off with how to sew an Elizabethan shift, or at least how I did so. Even back then, I was very uncomfortable with the idea of telling somebody, here's how you make this thing. And I was way more comfortable saying, here's how I made this specific thing. There's a million different ways to do everything, so it's really difficult to say, here's the one way that you should definitely do it, you know? I also call it a shift / smock / chemise. I didn't know which term to stick with because they're all used so interchangeably for this garment. Ooh, I've already found the first thing that I would definitely change if I were writing this today. I say, fortunately, I had plenty of white, lightweight fabric. Ew, cotton, I know. Really? I was a college student with no money. It's fine that it was cotton. If I made a shift right now today, a shirt, whatever, out of cotton, it would still be fine. It is a weirdly defensive thing that if I were to write this post today, I would say I'm using linen, but cotton or rayon would be perfectly fine too, even polyester. It's nobody else's business what you make your shirt out of. Next up, start out with your first piece of fabric. Mine is twice my height, from shoulder to ground. Oh, okay, I see. It's because it's a floor-length garment, so I'm saying from the floor to shoulder times 2. Let's do that. And next, I think is width. I did elbow to elbow. It is a little bit fuller with this gathering than I think I want, so I'm gonna go just a little bit narrower, maybe like bicep to bicep. Let's go for that. Approximately here to here. 21, 22. Okay, so I think I'm going to put this on the table where it'll be a little bit easier to cut rather than doing it in the air. Alrighty, and now that I've got it laid out nice and smooth, a little bit easier to cut here on the table, I'm going to measure out that 22 inches, not counting the selvage because I don't particularly love the look of the selvage, so I'm just going to cut that off. The nice thing about linen is that you can just kind of cut right alongside the threads. Obviously you can pull the threads, that's another pretty common thing, but I find this to be nearly as good with very similar results and a lot faster. So I have cut out my 22-inch wide strip. I'm going to set aside the other stuff for now. We will come back to that later. I don't particularly want to keep the selvage in, so I'll just go ahead and cut that off now. Done with our selvage, so on to the next step. I have my body piece here, and my next instruction is to cut a long shallow hole in the top for the neck hole. No measurements, no other information provided. Now, if I were to write this, I would probably specifically say choose what you want your shoulder measurement to be, and then marking that on both sides, and then cutting whatever's in the middle. This one actually is 6, and I'm gonna go just a little bit smaller. I'm gonna go 5, so that the shoulder seam here is just a little bit more in. Yeah, I think that's a good plan. So something that I did not include in my original instructions or original design was little shoulder gussets to help reinforce the shoulder where it's kind of an awkward spot to be turning this very narrow, shallow V of the neckline into the rounded part of a collar. Putting in a little triangular gusset there will help kind of make it form the right shape, even though I didn't do it on the original, and that is fine. There are extant shirts both with and without the gusset for this style, so you can absolutely go either way, but I'd like to go ahead and add one, so I think I will do about a 2-inch gusset. While this will be the finished size of the neck opening, sort of, we're actually going to cut a little bit further so that we can insert that shoulder gusset. It doesn't even actually need to be like a shallow kind of fish-shaped cut, which is what I did originally. You can just do a straight line. Shallow cut complete. So now I'm going to consult the text. Cut it down the middle in the front. I made it all the way to like my belly button. That's excessively long. I mean, it's fine, it doesn't hurt anything. To kind of middle of the chest is probably fine. All right, center cut, let's go. So I'm gonna go ahead and fold this in half. All I need to do is make a little nip. Try to make sure I'm only grabbing one layer. Do a quick measurement check here. Made 8 inches, probably about good. Oh, before I forget, it does mention here that making a fish face is not required, but it helps. So, just in case. It's been a long time since I've done silly face things. There we go. It's good luck, I'm pretty sure. What's next? I sewed up the hem on the opening in the front. Oh, on the opening in the front. I see. Okay, so I went ahead and turned under this edge twice and then top stitch it with machine, which is fine, but because that's like front and center and most visible to me in the mirror, as well as I suppose other people, not that they probably care, but I kind of care. So for my opening here, you could either literally do a double fold, you know, do kind of a very narrow fold, flip that over, fold it again, and then stitch this line. But I actually rather like doing rolled hems for these. So you just kind of pinch the fabric and roll it down. So you just pinch it and roll, roll, roll. Come on, there we go. Sometimes if you kind of do a couple rounds of it, that'll help encourage the roll to stay in place. So I'll prep a little section like this and then wrap it around my finger and stitch. So you end up with a much narrower than you could get if you did the double fold. So let's go ahead and get this stitched. So I have finished up that center front opening. For the neck gusset, it's just going to be a 2-inch by 2-inch right angle triangle, and I will make 2 of those. Then I'll cut the remaining little piece here so that I have a place to insert that little triangular gusset. So this will be cut more, but the triangle will replace the section that I cut away. So now I am supposed to go ahead and gather up the neck to fit the collar that I don't have and don't explain how to make. I mean, I guess I just assume that you like look at the picture, so it should be, in theory, the size of your neck. I'll go ahead and take the remainder of my fabric here and cut out a collar piece. I'll just measure around my neck, and my old shift, the collar was just a little bit taller than I quite liked. Let's go for about 1 inch. That seems to be a pretty good average-ish neck collar size, although there are definitely some that are quite large. So I mean, you're good either way, but I'm gonna go for a narrow one this time. So here are my neck bands, like so, with a little bit of extra room for seam allowance. So that is good, and you can see here that unfortunately it's not quite big enough to fit around this whole opening, so we need to gather this up so that it'll fit. In my instructions from 10 years ago, I recommend using the sewing machine to do a really loose, like basting stitch and gather it up that way. You could do that, but honestly, this opening here is so small, I'm just gonna go ahead and gather it by hand. We are just going to do a wee bit of gathering, maybe just under 1/4 inch from the edge, like so. Now, one gathering thread will totally work, but I do recommend 2, both back then and now. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go get 2 needles with thread, and we're going to stitch them together at the same time. I like doing it this way because you end up with really, really controlled pleats whereas when you do just one row of gathering, they end up getting kind of wild, if that makes sense. Whereas with 2 rows of stitches to gather, they end up creating kind of a tidy line that just makes it much easier to then sew a collar or whatever on top of it. If stitching with 2 needles at once is understandably just a little bit too fiddly, what you can do is take just one of your needles, do a simple even running stitch, and then pick up your second needle and repeat the same stitch. Trying, if you can, to follow the same sort of up-down pathway as the previous one, and then when you pull on these, they should have this kind of like ridge effect where everything is pulled up and down the same because they were stitched the same way. So we are all nicely gathered up and ready for the collar, but before I put that on, I'm actually going to go ahead and add the ruffle to the top edge, which means that I need to cut out some more very long strips just like this to use for the ruffle part. On the original and in the blog, I mentioned that it's about 3 to 4 times the size of the collar. You might want more if you want to do a true figure 8 style ruff set, but for this kind of a more casual wear thing, nah, 3 to 4 is going to be pretty good. Now for the width of the ruff, I made an interesting choice. I folded the ruff in half and then stitched this folded edge into the collar. And I say here that if you want a more historically accurate ruff, you should do a tiny little hem on your ruff piece. The downside of doing the fold in half method, which works, but it is very bulky, and it'll have a much more fine and nice sort of feel if you do that rolled edge instead. Oh, I'm actually a little bit pleasantly surprised. I mentioned that, you know, no matter which style of edge finishing you do, make sure that you cut out your ruff on the cross grain so that you have selvage on either end of your strip and not selvage along the top edge. The reason that you want to do that is, in part, it's period practice. From what we can tell, the vast majority of extant shirts and ruffs seem to have it so that the cross grain is what's going across the ruff rather than straight grain. And to some extent, people have noticed in their personal experience that linen is much more likely to sort of scrunch up on the straight grain, which you don't want your ruff to scrunch up. You want it to spring out and be lively and fluffy as much as possible. In the event that your ruffle strip exceeds the width of your fabric and you need to put a join in there, now historically they would have put selvage to selvage and then whip stitched these edges together. However, their selvage was a lot prettier than our modern machine made selvage. So what I prefer to do is cut these selvages off like so, and then fold the edges opposite ways. So this one I will fold up, this one will go folded down, and then you just hook them together, these 2 edges, and finally stitch from this side and from this side. And when you're done, you should end up with a very fine, fine, fine little tiny seam between your strip. Alrighty, so I have prepared all of my little ruff edges, both my neck ruff and the little wrist ruffles. So edges are prepared. I also ended up labeling them just because I had a few too many skinny rectangular long pieces on my table and I was worried that I would start forgetting which one was meant for which purpose. For fun, I took one of my little rectangular scraps and did a machine turned hem just to see what it might look like if I were to do the ruff with a machine rolled hem. Looks pretty good. This is totally a fine hem. I think that whether you want to do it by hand or with machine, it works just fine either way, really. However, I don't recommend doing the double wide strip and then folding it half. Don't do that. What I'm gonna do next now is gather up, just like I did with the neckline. I'm gonna go ahead and gather up my ruff pieces so that they can then be squished down to the size of the neck and collar band pieces. Instead of gathering the ruffle by hand like I did with the neckline, I'm instead going to use my very exciting pleater machine. I don't often have a chance to dig this out, but It is a cool little thing that you can sometimes get on eBay for a lot cheaper than new, which is what I did a few years back. First, I get a length of thread that is at least double the length of my collar piece, preferably a little bit more, just for good measure. And then I thread both ends of that thread through the first two needles here on the left. So I have a loop at this end and a pair of thread ends at this end. Then I'm going to carefully feed my fabric through the side here, and I will end up with two nice and evenly gathered strips right at the end of my ruffle. This is so handy if you find yourself doing this a lot. As I finish up getting all of these neck and wrist ruffles nicely pleated up, I do really quickly want to show you what it looks like if you do it by machine. What you'll do is take your machine and set it to a very long stitch length, and then you do 2 rows, trying not to get too much further than your maximum seam allowance if you can, and then you grab the top 2 threads of your 2 rows and pull them tight. I really recommend doing the double row of stitches whenever you're doing a gathering like this. It just makes it so much more controlled and less like wildly ruffly, which is really, really hard to then stitch onto something else. Alrighty, so I'm gonna go ahead and get these sewn into the cuff pieces, but first, to help get things under control, I'm actually going to iron them down so they're not so topsy-turvy like this. So I just start on the gathered side, kind of scrunch up the ruffle end. And so this is a whole lot easier to put into the collar pieces than this. This being flat makes it so much easier to take my pieces here, sandwich it in between, and then stitch a line here. So I have sewn around the 3 edges of the collar band, and now I just flip them right side out to make my neck ruffle as well as my pair of little wrist ruffles. Obviously you'd want to very nicely make sure that all of your seam allowances are completely poked out and nice and neat, and then iron these flat, but here's kind of the general look. I think it's gonna be very, very cute once the shirt is done. So I need to look at my instructions, see what's next. So I do actually mention here already a change that I'm like, I wouldn't do this again, but it is included in all the pictures, so of course I have to like address it, which is that originally when I first made that shirt right there, I put a layer of canvas in the neckline as well, because in my mind, you need something stiff to help hold it up. In reality, starch is plenty for that. I actually ended up later on coming and opening up the neckline and taking that canvas out, although if I remember correctly, I think I did so in a very lazy way. Like I didn't completely unstitch it and unpick the canvas out. I think I just opened it up part way and like cut out as much as I could. Not a very neat job, and the neckline is still very bulky because of that. So next it looks like I'm going to take my little neck ruffle collar piece here and attach one side of it to the shirt that I gathered up a little bit earlier, fold down the other side, and then hand stitch that in place. Okay, it's kind of strange that I'm doing all of this collar prep before touching the sleeves at all, but that's fine, all right. And next up for the sleeves, I need it to be how big? Let's see. I don't say. I simply say attach the sleeves. They are long enough to go all the way to my fingertips. It's just a rectangle, no fancy shapes. That's it. All you get for sleeve instruction. I am very amused at how obviously uncomfortable I was in front of cameras and stuff. I couldn't like stand with a straight face and like demonstrate the thing. Instead, I had to like make bizarre faces. Now I don't care. I'll make silly faces, but like it's with intention. Maybe. Anyways, so the sleeve. It needs to be the length of my arm. The selvage, if it's going this way, then you want the sleeve arm to be going with the selvage, I think. For the most part, the general rule, as I think of it, is if it's going down your body, then you want the selvage to be in line with that. I guarantee that there's absolutely exceptions to that rule. So I think that's what I'm gonna do. Let me find my selvage. It needs to be this way. Yeah, like that. How long is that? This is very professional. All right, so shoulder to fingertips. It's about there. So I will just cut a little nip. That way I keep that measurement. If anything, it might be a little bit long, but it's better to cut your sleeves a little bit long, put them on the garment, try it on, and decide that you want to shorten them up a little bit, than to go the other way, right? There's my little nip, and I'm going to do the same, just kind of following the grain line down. So I have cut my length like so, and let's see, it'd be great if I fold this in half and this just happens to be the perfect width for the sleeves. That's not bad. It can go underneath my arms with still probably an inch or so of ease around there, although usually you'll want to toss a gusset in there just for like excellent range of motion. But that's, I mean, it's maybe a little bit baggy on this side, although once it's gathered into a cuff, maybe it'll just be real cute. So I think I am actually pretty satisfied with this as a like starter sleeve thing. So what I'm going to do is cut this halfway mark that I folded into it so that instead of being one sleeve that's extra thick, it'll be two sleeves. And then from there, I think I am actually ready to go ahead and follow the instructions, attach the sleeves. Which is to say, I will sew on the like shoulder area of this sleeve. Yeah. Although now that I think about it, damn it, I'm pretty sure the pattern actually doesn't include a gusset. Let me check. No, there's no triangle right here like you would normally see. That worked okay for this one because it's actually a very, very wide shift, but because I made the new one a bit more narrow, I don't think I'm gonna actually quite have enough play in there. Yeah, I think I'm gonna go ahead and add a little gusset. If I'm remembering correctly, the extant gussets averaged like between 3 to 5 inches. So I will cut a little square gusset and sew it to one corner of the sleeve, kind of like right here. And you'll see what that looks like once I attach it to the shirt. All right, so before I stitch these shoulder seams, right now it's currently just pinned into place, not actually stitched yet. I like to just double check that I've correctly arranged everything. So I make sure that this is in fact the outside of the garment and that the outside of the shoulder seam or the gusset seam is all correct. I sort of re-verify things before I then go ahead and stitch them in place, and I generally find that to be very helpful to do always whenever you pin something in place and then stitch it. Just double check real quick that everything's where it's supposed to be, you know? Alrighty, so I have attached the shoulders like so, and now what I'm gonna do is stitch the sleeve including the gusset, so it'll get stitched in kind of looking like that at the end. Oh, and my dog would like to come inside. Yes. Yeah, that's what I figured. All right, so then I will stitch down the side, but not very far. I'm probably only gonna actually stitch to about here because I wanna verify that the top half of this will fit me nicely, and I wanna know sooner rather than later whether or not that's not going to be the case. I'm already pretty sure I'm going to have to add some width to below the hips, but I'm 99% sure up here should be fine, but just in case, I'm gonna go ahead and stitch it up and try it on so that I can verify that the top half is gonna fit me okay. The shoulders fit just fine, although I think that these sleeves are indeed maybe just a little bit longer than I need to be. I can pinch off a whole 2 inches and have still plenty of movement and floof and goodness. So yeah, I think I'm gonna go ahead and just take off 2 inches. Next, we have the sleeves are going to be gathered into the cuff, and then gather the sleeve ends like we already did. I think what I'm trying to say there is gather the sleeve ends like we did with the neckline. not really like a great complete sentence. One thing I actually do really like about this method that I worked with 10 years ago was a lot of, I don't know, wrap that piece of fabric around you and see if it fits, and just use that as your basis for sewing. It might not be perfect, and there'll be things that make that really hard to replicate that exact same thing if you want to make the garment again. It's a little bit like draping a garment on you and just getting your fit that way without taking the pattern from it to keep as a reference for later, because it is harder to remake a pattern once you've already stitched it into a garment, but not impossible, and especially not so hard with such a rectangular construction garment like we're making today. But I don't know, I like how beginner friendly this is. You take the thing, you put it on your arm, and that's the size that you cut it to. I could appreciate that. Maybe it's because I was a beginner that I was like, yeah, that's the easiest way to do it. So for the cuff, I did again deviate. I'm doing a lot of that. For this one, I wanted just a simple plain cuff, but now I would like a cute little ruffle to match the neckline. So instead of just simply taking one piece of fabric and covering the ends of my sleeve, I went ahead and did the exact same thing that I did with the neckline. You know, 2 pieces of fabric with a ruffle sticking out in between. I have found a spelling error. I should have hand sewn this part too, TWO. Alrighty, so the sleeve cuffs are done. Mostly, they're constructed. The last thing that we're missing, however, is a closure so that they can stay nice and tight against the wrist, looking super cute and pretty. I do mention a little bit further down here that you could use hooks, buttons, or lacing holes to do the collar and cuffs so that you can close them. I think I am going to go ahead and do lacing holes for this one. Let's hop to some eyelets. So to make my little eyelets at the end of each of the cuffs and the neck, I'm going to poke them with a little awl like so, and I'm going to try and aim for just right where the seam allowance finishes inside the shirt. That way, for the most part, I'm only needing to pierce through 2 layers, but the leading edge is still reinforced by that extra 2 layers of seam allowance inside the shirt. So I feel like that's kind of like a primo spot. Otherwise, you can go a little bit closer to the edge if you like, if you really want to try and pierce through the seam allowance so that you have 4 layers all around your eyelet. That might be a good idea if you feel like your fabric is just a little bit on the weak side, or like you feel like you really want that extra level of reinforcement. I usually aim for just past it though and call that good. And then I am going to stitch a little row of stitches around the eyelet, you know, just past where I had poked. And then I'm going to whip stitch all around the eyelet hole. Now you can, if you like, do a buttonhole stitch. I usually just do a plain one like this. Whichever one suits your fancy is just fine. Alrighty, so this is looking pretty good so far. The only downside is the side is not quite enough. Because I narrowed the shoulders, that means that I also narrowed what was in the hips, which means that unlike the original shirt, I am going to have to add some gores to the side to help fill in the empty space, but that is easy enough and, you know, absolutely period practice. You can do it either way, so don't say that like one is better or more accurate than the other. They both totally existed at the same time. It's great. So I'm going to add some big old triangles. I think about 8 inches at the bottom should be sufficient, so pretty narrow, and they'll just start here right underneath where the underarm gussets stopped. So we now have 2 triangles to insert into the side seam, one with a seam and one without. They're both fine, totally reasonable, but it's really nice because you can take a long skinny rectangle and then the parts that you cut from one side and the other, you can just put together to make yourself a second triangle, which is great. So now we'll go ahead and stitch these into the side seams. So my triangles are both stitched in. As you can see, the edges are longer than they need to be, so I'm just going to do kind of a gentle cut to even out the hem. So now that our various pieces are assembled, we just need to iron the seam allowances open so that we can then fell them down. Whether you're gonna finish your insides or just leave them raw a la like Victorian construction techniques, either way, definitely recommend ironing your seams just because it'll make the finished garments, especially on the outside, look so much nicer. Ironing also means that it's time to talk sponsorships, thanks this month to the lovely folks over at Skillshare. If you haven't heard of it, it's an online learning community where membership gets you access to lessons on hundreds of different things, anything your creative heart desires. So many cool things like website design, 3D animation. Lately, I've been binging lots of interior design ones, like the one by Lauren Cox with the basics for making your perfect space. I'm in this room a lot. So it's been really engaging to watch each lesson and then look around to see how I can try and incorporate those things to make this a more beautiful and useful space for me. Potentially also other places soon. Skillshare is such a cool concept. There's no ads, they're always adding awesome new classes. The first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership, and after that it's less than $10 a month for an annual membership. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, definitely check them out. Now that the ironing is done, I can top stitch all of my seam allowances. Whether you do it by machine or by hand is really maker's choice. I did about 50-50 on this project. The chemise was rather long, so I did a deep hem tuck, as you can see here, although really I probably should have cut it higher and then just done a smaller hem. It's way easier around the curves. I did the sleeve ties, but still haven't tackled the neck closure, so I think I'm going to do a sewn-in version. Just open the seam up a bit and then tuck in the end of the tape and then tack it in place. Next, I'm going to add a bit of reinforcement to the stitching at the end of the neck opening. I didn't do this on the original 10 years ago, but I really should have, because I did get some tearing at this spot. To reinforce, I just add blanket stitches around the bottom of the curve and then stitch them together with several long stitches before covering those again with blanket stitches. This should help prevent rips and is also found on several of the Accent 16th century shirts. Bonus. Whew! And we are done. It's very exciting. I had a lot of fun with this project. It was really interesting to kind of maybe self-indulgently look back and see what I was up to 10 years ago and the way my brain worked, the way I wanted to share information and how similar or different that was to how I do it now. It's such an interesting thing. Not only did I have a lot of fun, I got a new shirt out of it, which I'm really excited to put this into my wear rotation. I love linen, so it's just really nice to be able to add more linen things to my wardrobe. I'm a big fan. One of the things that has me pretty excited about this shirt is I feel like it's going to be fairly versatile. I wear a lot of dresses with shirts underneath, and I think that this is going to fit in beautifully. I guess we will find out when I actually go ahead and try a bunch of things on with it, but I anticipate it'll work nicely.